I've heard this probably 30 times. And I'm a pharmacist, right? So I should get the chemistry part of it. Maybe I don't really, I'm not connecting or something in some way, but I've heard it a whole bunch of times, and I continue to forget it. And so we know some of our readers that a lot of them, or probably the biggest majority of them, are kind of neophytes at wine. And so it's all these new terms, and then we just go through it and we say, well, it goes through malolactic fermentation and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And they don't know what the heck we're talking about, or secondary fermentation or whatever. So it would be really helpful if you could explain how a wine goes through primary and secondary fermentation.
Right.
How all that works.
Well, the secondary fermentation, the malolactic fermentation, generally occurs in the barrel. And it generally occurs, it can occur if you inoculate the bacteria into the barrel. So you can actually purchase this bacteria, this malic bacteria from your local yeast provider. And it's a bacteria that you put into the atmosphere of the barrel, and it will basically ferment the wine a second time under a carbon dioxide lock. So if you have a bubbler, this is basically allows gas to go out without any other gas going in. So this is a carbon dioxide basically locked environment. You can basically instigate malolactic fermentation in a tank unnaturally if you buy the bacteria, which you can buy from any yeast producer, and you put it in the slurry with the wine, and you actually have to heat up the wine to a temperature that's hospitable for this bacteria. Normally, malolactic fermentation happens naturally in barrels, just because a colony of this bacteria has naturally occurred in these barrels, and it lives and thrives in these barrels. So what I do in my barrels is when I notice that one of the barrels is going through malolactic fermentation, which is that secondary fermentation, I'll take a dipper of it and I'll dipper it into all the other wines, and that will basically start that malolactic fermentation. It's a bacterial fermentation rather than a yeast, and I think it smooths out red wines. I think it gives it a really beautiful, smooth character. Malolactic fermentation is one of the reasons a red wine can start re-fermenting in a bottle. So if you've ever run across a red wine that's re-fermenting in the bottle, it's probably because of malolactic fermentation, because it didn't finish going through that secondary fermentation in the barrel that's so essential.
Okay, so let's step back just one more second to a little bit even more basic. So primary fermentation is you have yeast, that native yeast is on the grapes, and then it goes with the juice and with whether we're talking red or white.
Sometimes,
right?
not everybody uses native yeast. I actually inoculate yeast that I purchased from the company. It's a specific strain of yeast, and a lot of wineries do this. I would be very surprised if the majority of the wineries use natural yeast.
Okay.
Most of the wineries that I deal with inoculate their wine using
even from the beginning. Okay.
From the beginning, period.
Okay.
Because natural yeast fermentation, although it is traditional and it's the way it's been happening for a long time, you get a lot of kind of foreign bodies. And it's hard to control, it's hard to anticipate. Yeah, it's a little risky. If you know how to do it, you can usually do it well, but it is a little risky. If you choose the strain of yeast that you want to use, certain strains of yeast ferment hot and fast, and certain strains of yeast ferment slow and kind of gradually. And you can kind of over time and with experience determine what yeasts are going to be best for that particular grape or that particular blend of grapes, and then choose that specific strain of yeast, inoculate it into the wine when it's in one of those big tanks, and then you can kind of control the fermentation a little more as opposed to just like homing.
So the yeast feeds off the sugar.
Right.
Yeast eats sugar, and then the sugar content of the grape that we all think of as a table grape, right? So it's really sweet. Then the sugar content goes down because the yeast ate it, and the alcohol content goes up. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
And
so that's fermentation. That's what makes wine. That's what makes wine.
Any wine, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, white grapes generally do not go through secondary fermentation. They stick with that first fermentation in the stainless steel tank in a clean, sterile environment which has no foreign bodies. It's just the yeast, usually just the yeast that you've chosen to inoculate into it. Some people do use
Whites.
native yeast. Yeah, the whites.
Okay.
And then once the fermentation is done, you can choose to leave it dry, or you can cease the fermentation if you want to leave it a little dry.
By cease the fermentation by increasing the temperature or decreasing the temperature, making it colder.
Cold stabilizing.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a whole other thing.
Right.
But and whites usually only go through that primary fermentation unless they are oak aged.
Okay.
And then once the wines are put into oak barrels, the secondary fermentation called malolactic fermentation.
There we go.
That actually occurs in a CO2 rich environment under basically a CO2 block like this bubbler. So no oxygen is getting in, but CO2.
And CO2 is being produced because the yeast is eating the sugar, and that's no.
In malolactic fermentation, it's actually a bacterium.
Okay.
It's not a yeast.
Okay.
And you can purchase this bacteria artificially. Like if you want to put a wine through malolactic fermentation in a tank, you can. You just have to create the right environment in that tank and inoculate it with these bacteria.
Bacteria, not yeast, but is it still is the bacteria eating the sugar? Whatever sugar's left?
Yeah, and other solids. And it's producing, among other things, carbon dioxide.
Which is the byproduct.
Yeah.
And that's what's coming out.
And I really believe that malolactic fermentation is integral in a red wine. I think it gives it a little tiny bit more alcohol, but really more it's about smoothing out the wine, aging the wine, and giving it a beautiful kind of roundness. I've noticed that wines that don't go through malolactic fermentation for whatever reason, red wines, don't have that same kind of beautiful aged, finished character that wines that go through malolactic do.
Are there many red wines that don't? Or I imagine it's winemaker specific as to whether they choose to do malolactic with reds.
If you leave a wine in a barrel, generally a barrel will just have a natural colony of this bacterium in there that'll build up over time.
Okay.
So I don't have to inoculate my barrels with this bacterium because it exists in the barrel. And it'll just naturally, when the summer starts and it starts to get a little bit, it stays pretty consistent in here, but when it starts to get a little warmer, and then the bacterium gets active.
So if you didn't want that to happen, you'd have to put these in a colder environment.
And you wouldn't want to do that. You'd have to pull all the wine out of the barrels and put them in stainless. Yeah.
Okay. So then explain how whites. So my favorites, I know they're kind of out of fashion, but my favorites are still the oak barrel buttery Chardonnays.
Yeah.
And so if you were to put the Chardonnay that's already gone through the primary fermentation and then put it into an oak barrel, you would have to inoculate it with bacteria or not?
I mean, if you put it in a new barrel, like a new fresh oak barrel, which is customary with whites, because you don't want any dyeing from any purple tartrates that might be in the barrel from lots of reds being in there over a period of time. So if you put it in a new clean barrel or a neutral barrel, you probably don't have any of that malic bacteria.
So you have to add it in.
Yeah.
And then it would produce the carbon dioxide. And then the byproduct, the end byproduct is lactic acid?
Yeah, it converts the acid.
That buttery, creamy.
I'm not exactly sure what phenolics it produces, but it does convert the acid in the wine to make it more round, less acidic. I always put my red wines through malolactic fermentation because I know that by converting a lot of those acids, you reduce the acidity of the wine and you make the wine more palatable, rounder, smoother.
Say that one more time. By doing what?
Well,
too much pork.
No, but the malolactic fermentation, because it breaks a lot of those chains and it converts a lot of those acids that are present in a fresh wine, it reduces the acid content of the wine and it makes it less acidic. It makes it smoother, rounder, easier to drink. And Chardonnays, where maybe they didn't necessarily force it through malolactic, maybe it just didn't ever come into contact with that bacteria, so there was no need to put it through that, and they just oaked it in a tank with some oak chips and just called it a day. But if you put it in a barrel, you probably are going to really benefit from a malolactic.